I remember the night they almost stole my house, the $280,000 corner lot I'd bought after 18 years on the federal bench, not with a gun or a crowbar, but with $4,800 in fake HOA violations timed perfectly to hit my mailbox while I was 200 miles away holding my mother's hand in a hospice room that smelled like disinfectant, stale coffee, and endings. And if they had picked anyone else on this street, maybe it would have worked, but they picked me, Judge Evelyn Carter, and that turned their little neighborhood hustle into the last case they'd ever run. For almost 3 years in Ridgeview Meadows, a quiet 1990s subdivision with 180 homes, mostly retirees and young families, houses hovering between $280,000 and $320,000, I'd been just Evelyn from Lot 42, the woman who waved from her driveway, argued about streaming prices, and hired the approved contractor Halpin Lawn and Garden to keep the grass inside regulation height. And I loved that anonymity, loved not hearing your honor over the fence, loved being nobody special, right up until last spring, when my mother's cancer turned aggressive, when I took leave from the United States District Court and moved into a plastic chair beside her bed at St. Helena Hospice Center, living on vending machine snacks and half-slept nights while watching the strongest person I knew fade away. The day after her funeral, still in the same black dress, eyes swollen, throat raw, I came home and found my front door half blocked by certified mail, the house smelling like dust and old flowers, wilting bouquets slumped on the counter, and on top of the pile was a thick envelope stamped Ridgeview Meadows Community Association. Final notice, listing $2,400 in violations already due and more pending. My hands shaking as I read 12 citations for grass half an inch too tall, even though Halpin Lawn and Garden had invoices for weekly cuts, 6 violations for a non-compliant mailbox color, even though my forest green box matched nearly every mailbox on the block, and a $900 fine for unauthorized landscaping modifications because I'd removed a dead rosebush with written email approval that I still had saved in a neat little folder on my phone. The dates hit harder than the numbers, every alleged violation falling in the exact weeks I was documented at St. Helena Hospice Center, photographed at my mother's bedside, surrounded by nurses who could testify I hadn't been anywhere near my lawn, yet at the bottom of the letter was a tidy thread in print signed by Monica Langford, President, Ridgeview Meadows Community Association, giving me 10 days to pay in full or face foreclosure proceedings, 10 days to watch my home, my refuge, turned into a line item in someone else's investment portfolio. It took 3 days of voicemail hell to get Monica Langford on the phone, and when I did, her voice was a mix of fake concern and steel. Violations are violations. Ms. Carter, grief doesn't excuse property neglect. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in a senior community with less responsibility, she said, as if my mother's death were a scheduling conflict, and something cold and very familiar slid into place inside me. The same feeling I get on the bench when I realize the charming defendant in front of me has been lying to everyone in his life, including himself. So I started doing what judges do best. I looked for patterns, took long walks through Ridgeview Meadows pretending to admire landscaping while noting which houses had fresh for sale signs and shell-shocked owners. Then went to the county records office where the air smells like dust and forgotten stories, and found that 3 homes with heavy violation histories had recently sold for $40,000 below market value, all to the same shell company, LDG Acquisitions, which traced back to Langford Development Group. And the more I pulled, the more I saw the same names on the fine notices, the same strange spacing error after periods, the same timing hitting families in the middle of illness or loss, until the whole pattern looked less like coincidence and more like a carefully designed foreclosure machine disguised as community standards. The moment that made my blood go cold wasn't in a file, though. It was when I looked up during one of those walks and saw Monica Langford's white Lexus parked outside my 82-year-old neighbor Helen Doyle's house. Helen clutching a violation letter with trembling hands, tears cutting tracks down her cheeks. And in that snapshot, I saw the whole scheme, not as numbers on a spreadsheet, but as a business model built on grief, fear, and confusion. And I knew I couldn't just save myself and move on, not and look at myself in the mirror or sit on a bench where I ask other people to do the right thing under pressure. 48 hours later, I received a crumpled notice announcing an emergency HOA meeting to address ongoing violations threatening property values, scheduled for Tuesday at 2 p.m., in violation of their own requirement for 7 days' notice and evening sessions. But rules are always optional to people who think they own the room. So I went to our musty little community center anyway. Found maybe a dozen nervous residents scattered across squeaky metal chairs, and at the front, Monica Langford in a navy blazer and perfect blonde bob, seated behind a folding table like a tiny monarch. Her 19-year-old nephew Kyle Langford, promoted to certified inspector, beside her, gripping a clipboard like a shield. She clicked through poorly made slides of my lawn, my mailbox, the empty spot where the dead rosebush once stood, calling me a repeat offender, and gesturing theatrically at Kyle, who nodded along as she announced that violations had already triggered preliminary lien filings to protect the community. And when I stood, binder in hand, and asked to respond, she said, "This isn't a courtroom, Ms. Carter. This is a board meeting." And I replied, "Then why am I being condemned without a chance to present evidence?" Before slamming that binder down hard enough to make her styrofoam cup jump, spreading out printed approvals, invoices, photos, everything lined up like exhibits at trial. She skimmed my documents for half a second, dismissed them as easily fabricated, and then, in front of everyone, implied that I was lying because desperate homeowners do desperate things, while casually confirming that the board had voted liens in a private session and didn't need homeowner input, at which point I took out my phone, hit record, and said loud enough for the back row and the cheap camera in the corner to hear. For the record, I'm documenting that this board is filing liens based on alleged violations that occurred while I was at St. Helena Hospice Center with my dying mother, ignoring written approvals, contractor receipts, and proper notice requirements. You could feel the energy shift as those words hung in the air, back straightening, eyes narrowing, whispers starting. And after the meeting, a retired vet named Jack Turner, who'd been sitting in the corner like he wanted to disappear, walked over and handed me a folded sheet of paper with 15 addresses, violation dates, and sale prices, all suspiciously low, all sold to LDG Acquisitions, and said quietly, "You're not the first, ma'am. You might be the last if you do something." From there, the escalation felt almost scripted. Daily 6 a.m. wellness checks where Monica and Kyle measure my grass with a plastic ruler, photographed imaginary paint chips, counted non-existent decorations, and wrote fresh violations for the angle of my parked car, service cancellations as Halpin Lawn and Garden, dropped my contract for being too litigious, my pool card mysteriously failing, my mailbox lock replaced without notice, like they were tightening a noose made of petty inconveniences, hoping I'd tap out and sell. Instead, I spent my lunch breaks in the courthouse, pulling sale records, tracing shell companies, comparing budgets, and finally digging up the original 1994 incorporation documents for Ridgeview Meadows Community Association, which showed homeowner rights and protections that had been quietly erased over time, including mandatory audits, open book policies, and an emergency governance intervention clause that allowed 25% of homeowners, with proof of financial misconduct, to suspend the board and trigger state oversight, a clause no one had ever told us about, a legal fire axe hidden behind a wall of fake bylaws. By the time I sat in Michael Alvarez's cramped office, surrounded by whiteboards and case files from other HOAs, and told him who I really was, Judge Evelyn Carter, United States District Court Judge, we knew Monica Langford's operation had siphoned over $2 million in equity from vulnerable families across several neighborhoods, using violation harassment, bogus liens, and insider shell companies to scoop up homes cheap, flip them, or bundle them into development deals like the duplex she'd already planned for my corner lot. And we agreed on a simple plan: build an airtight case, organize the neighbors, and then let Monica walk into a public meeting thinking she was about to crush a troublesome widow, only to find out she'd been circling a federal judge with a loaded file and nothing left to lose. On the night of that final emergency meeting, with 40-plus residents jammed into the hot, buzzing community center, local news cameras lurking near the back, and my little war counsel, Olivia Hayes with her spreadsheets, Jack Turner with his list of victims, Grace Park with city planning documents, Michael Alvarez with a stack of pleadings ready to file, and Helen Doyle clutching her confession like a lifeline. Monica Langford strutted to the microphone, backed by Kyle and her cousin deputy, Nolan Langford, and announced that we were gathered because one resident, me, had been terrorizing the board and would soon face criminal charges for harassment and conspiracy. She handed her cousin a folder full of forged violation reports, spliced audio, staged photos, and he began to stumble through a statement about probable cause when Helen Doyle, tiny and shaking but steady in her resolve, stood up in the front row and said, "Monica, I can't help you lie anymore." Then read aloud how she'd been paid to sign inspection forms she'd never conducted, how she'd been threatened with liens if she refused, how she'd watched neighbor after neighbor pushed into selling, and finally realized she'd been participating in something that felt, in her words, like legalized robbery. In that instant, the room snapped awake, people turning on their chairs, whispering, staring at Monica with a mix of anger and dawning recognition. And when Monica tried to shout Helen down, calling her confused and forgetful, even Deputy Nolan took a step back from her, eyes flicking from the papers to my calm face in the back row, as if some part of him finally understood that he was standing on the wrong side of a very bright line. So I walked to the front, took the microphone, and did what I do best. I told the truth plainly, but with every ounce of authority I have. My name is Judge Evelyn Carter. I am a United States District Court judge, and what I've witnessed in this community is not a dispute over grass. It is a pattern of fraud, extortion, and civil rights violations carried out under the color of HOA authority. Then I took out my credentials, let the badge catch the fluorescent light, and watched the color drain from Monica's face as the room fell utterly silent. I explained in one long, relentless flow the fake violations, the below-market sales, the shell companies tied to Langford Development Group, the missing money in our budgets, the secret development plans for my lot, the forged inspection forms with Helen's signature, the vandalism and threats caught on security cameras, the original 1994 documents giving us the power to suspend the board, and the federal statutes, mail fraud, wire fraud, fair housing violations, racketeering, that they had tripped over and over again while assuming no one would ever connect the dots. And then, in front of everyone, I called the FBI, identified myself, and asked for agents to respond to an active fraud and racketeering situation inside Ridgeview Meadows. When the black SUVs finally pulled up and Special Agent Carla Ramirez walked in with her team, it felt less like a movie and more like a pressure valve exploding, neighbors crying, clapping, filming on their phones as Monica, Kyle, and their pet attorney were placed in handcuffs. Deputy Nolan quietly stepped aside and cooperated, and Agent Ramirez told the room that based on our evidence, this was the largest residential HOA fraud scheme their office had uncovered, with over $2 million in stolen equity and 23 families forced into distressed sales. Months later, after guilty pleas, restitution orders, and a new transparent board, I sit in my garden where her duplex was supposed to rise, listening to kids splash in the reopened pool, passing the little forest green mailbox that started this war, and I think about my mother's last words, stand up for what's right, even when it hurts, and I know we did, not just for me, but for every neighbor who thought they had no power. So now I'm asking you, if your HOA, your boss, your board, your little local tyrant decides your pain is their profit, do you keep your head down and hope they never pick your name? Or do you document, organize, push back, and trust that sometimes, when ordinary people refuse to be quiet, justice doesn't just show up in a courtroom. It shows up in a cramped community center with bad chairs, and one person finally saying, "No more."